She didn't pack a suitcase, just slung her old brown tote over one shoulder like she was heading to a casual overnight at a cousin's house. Her voice stayed even, almost bored. "I think some time apart will help you appreciate me more." I said nothing. Not out of shock, out of calculation. The way she leaned against the doorframe, hand on her hip, told me everything. This wasn't a breakdown. It wasn't a fight. It was a performance. No tears. No yelling. No demands. Just a smug little half-smile and her keys dangling between two fingers like a cat flicking its tail. "I'm not moving out. I just need space," she added, her eyes watching mine carefully, gauging for reaction. "Just staying at Mark's tonight. The couch. He's a friend. You've met him." She wanted discomfort, not separation. She wanted me sitting in the kitchen hours later wondering who she was laughing with, whether she was really on the couch, whether I was being tested or replaced. I nodded once, slowly, and stepped aside from the hallway. All right. That was it. No argument. No chase. No plea. Just the door clicking behind her as she left, with a forced calm that only made the tension more obvious. I waited until I heard her car engine fade down the street before I moved. Not to follow. Not to call. I went to the living room and sat in silence, letting the moment play back like a loop I could study. Her tone hadn't wavered. The language was careful. It felt like she was reading from a script. Every word carried an intentional weight, but none of it landed with surprise. She hadn't come to the decision in the kitchen that evening. She'd decided before. She wanted to teach me something. That's what she said. Appreciate me more. As if affection was a quiz I failed and now she was assigning homework. She wanted to watch me squirm, to stir my sense of loss before it was even real. But here's the thing about trying to push someone into panic. It only works if they actually panic. I didn't. Instead, I noticed, not just the words, the rehearsed rhythm, the lack of hesitation. Like she'd said it out loud before, maybe not to me, but to someone. The plan didn't start in our house. It started wherever her mind had already wandered before she crossed the line. She thought space would unsettle me. That uncertainty would break the stalemate she believed we were stuck in. But space works both ways. And silence? That's a language I speak fluently. She left to teach me a lesson. So I sat still and started taking notes. It didn't hit me right away, that sense of something rehearsed. But hours later, long after she was gone and the house had gone still, I found myself replaying it in slow motion. The way she had said it, the exact pitch of her voice. She wasn't searching for words. She delivered them. That's what struck me first. There's a rhythm to real emotion. Hesitations, repetitions, that unsteady breath when someone isn't sure how their words will land. But she'd been smooth. Not calm, controlled, scripted. Her exact line had been, "Maybe time apart will help you appreciate me more." She didn't look down after she said it, didn't flinch. She waited, poised like an actor holding for the camera, knowing exactly what scene she was in. That smirk, too, barely there, like she'd earned some inside joke I wasn't privy to. It wasn't cruel. It was smug. That's worse, in some ways. Cruelty at least admits there's conflict. Smugness pretends superiority. I stood in the hallway the next morning staring at the spot where she delivered her monologue. Same worn rug. Same overhead light buzzing faintly. But it all felt staged now, like I'd wandered into a set after filming Wrapped and was left trying to reconstruct the script. I ran the scene again in my mind, her foot tapping faintly, the hand on the hip, that offhand mention of Mark. As if he just volunteered his couch without prompting. As if coworkers made a habit of offering last-minute refuge for wives conducting appreciation exercises. I barely remembered Mark. Tall, pale, polite enough in passing. Nothing remarkable except the way she always described him, as a harmless dork. Her words. Someone I shouldn't feel threatened by. That alone should have raised my suspicions earlier. She'd gone out of her way to defuse anything before there was even a question. But now, I saw the shape of it. The way she'd smiled when she said his name. Not fondly, but strategically. She wanted me to hear it. She wanted the name to sit in my head while she was gone. This wasn't an impulse. It was a presentation. A plan, polished just enough to pass for emotional honesty. She thought I'd flinch. Thought I'd chase. Instead, I stood still. Not frozen, processing. There's a difference between being blindsided and watching the blade descend in slow motion. One stuns you, the other sharpens you. And I wasn't stunned anymore. It's strange how the mind works when you give it space. Not just time, space. Distance from the noise. That night, without her voice echoing off the walls, the silence brought everything else into focus. The signs had been there, but not in the places most people look, not in passwords or account balances. Nothing so obvious. They lived in her behavior. 3 weeks ago, she'd come home wearing a new scent. Not overwhelming, subtle, citrus layered over something woody. I'd made a comment offhand, expecting the usual banter. New perfume? She'd waved it off. Oh, I don't wear it around here, she'd said, tossing her shoes off by the door. Just something for the office. I remember thinking how odd that sounded. Not the perfume. The phrasing. Like there was a boundary between who she was out there and who she let me see at home. But I let it go. You do that when you trust someone. You let it go. I shouldn't have. Then there were the inside jokes. Phrases she'd throw out while scrolling her phone, grinning at something on the screen. Oh my God, classic, she'd mutter. I'd ask what was funny. You wouldn't get it, she'd say, still smiling. Not dismissively, but just enough to put up a wall. At first, I chalked it up to work culture. Shared jokes with colleagues. Not everything needs to be translated between spouses. But over time, the frequency shifted. The jokes multiplied. The explanations vanished. The wall got thicker. There's something else too. One night, about a month ago, we were out at dinner with a few of her coworkers. Mark was there. He was polite, engaging. But what stuck with me was how she laughed at his jokes. Not the laugh itself, but the timing. It was preloaded. Like she already knew the punchlines. It didn't click then. But now, with everything stripped back, I saw it differently. Her world had started splitting. One life she shared. Another she kept to herself. I didn't accuse her. Didn't demand explanations. That's not how you learn anything useful. People lie when cornered. They reveal themselves when they think you aren't looking. So I shifted. I stopped asking questions and started remembering things. Details I'd brushed past. Patterns I hadn't stitched together. Her morning routines. The playlists she'd started listening to. The way she answered texts with a half smile she thought I didn't notice. You learn more watching than pressing. That's when I knew something deeper was wrong. She hadn't left to teach me a lesson. She'd left because she thought I wouldn't recognize the test. The moment that broke the pattern didn't come from strategy. Not from tech. Not from tracking numbers or messages or timelines. It came from a hoodie. She walked through the front door the next morning like nothing had shifted. Tossed her tote onto the kitchen bench, yawned like it had been a long night of actual sleep, and headed straight for the fridge. I stayed seated at the table, coffee in hand, watching, not in suspicion, but clarity. I wasn't waiting for a confession. I was studying a scene. And that's when I saw it. The hoodie was too big. Navy blue. Faded logo on the sleeve. Not new, not styled, not hers. I'd never seen it in the house before. It didn't match anything she owned. She hadn't noticed. Or maybe she had and assumed I wouldn't. That told me everything. I didn't sleep great, she said, back turned as she rummaged through the shelves. Mark's couch is awful. I'm stiff all over. I watched the way her fingers hovered over the eggs, pretending indecision. The hoodie hung off her like a shrug she'd borrowed on a cold porch. Not intentionally seductive. Not staged. Just careless. Familiar. It's one thing to keep secrets. It's another to forget you're keeping them. She hadn't meant to bring it home. She hadn't expected me to notice. Or maybe she hoped I would and say nothing, because silence keeps things cleaner than confrontation. She made herself a smoothie like it was any other Tuesday. I waited. Watched her sip, stretch, scroll her phone with exaggerated nonchalance. She talked about weekend plans, whether we'd RSVP to that anniversary dinner for her cousin. Nothing urgent. Nothing apologetic. It was all so normal it became surreal. But the hoodie didn't disappear. It stayed visible, draped over her like a reminder she didn't intend to give. And I let it stay. I didn't ask. Didn't raise an eyebrow. Just logged it. Silently, fully. People get sloppy when they think they're in control. That's the part she misunderstood. She assumed my silence was surrender. It wasn't. It was strategy. Let her believe I was still in the fog. That I was playing the role she assigned. Distant husband. Learning a lesson. Meanwhile, I'd already started rewriting the script. She came home in someone else's clothes, and she didn't flinch. So I did the only logical thing left. I didn't flinch either. It was a casual backyard gathering. Someone's birthday, maybe an anniversary. One of those social obligations that exists just enough on the fringe of friendship that you can't skip it without explanation. She was in her element, laughing, weaving between conversations like nothing had changed. You'd think we were the happiest couple there. She kept her hand on my arm just enough to be noticed. Not affectionate, performative. I let her do it. Let the act play out. But I stayed quiet. Not withdrawn, measured. That's when it happened. A mutual acquaintance, someone I barely knew outside of these polite gatherings, approached with a look I didn't recognize. Not pity, not concern, something more complicated. Like he wasn't sure what I already knew. He handed me a drink, leaned slightly closer, and said it too softly for anyone else to hear. "So, you okay after everything?" I didn't react. Just turned to him, eyebrows slightly raised. Neutral. Controlled. His eyes flicked away instantly. "Forget I said that," he mumbled, walking off like he'd broken some unspoken rule. But it was too late. That was the crack. Up until that moment, it had all been speculation, unspoken shifts, patterns I'd connected in silence. But now I knew she'd been talking, spinning something, framing her absence not as a mistake but as a narrative. That changed the game. It meant she wasn't just managing guilt, she was building an alibi. Something she could point to later if things went south. We were struggling. I just needed space. He shut me out. The usual pretext people use to pre-soften the impact of their own choices. But here's the truth. People don't talk that way unless they're preparing for fallout. She hadn't just stayed out for a night. She'd been laying down the framework for a version of events she could survive, one she could tell friends, family, maybe even legal counsel, if things ever reached that point. And she'd underestimated me. Because now I wasn't just a husband watching his wife drift away. I was the one listening for her story before it finished forming. That evening I stopped watching her. I started watching everyone around her. And for the first time, I realized I wasn't the only one who had doubts. I was just the last one she thought would catch on. There's a moment when a man stops asking why and starts preparing for what's next. That moment came quietly, 2 days after the party, while I stood in the garage holding the spare set of house keys she didn't know I'd found. I didn't rage. I didn't spiral. I redefined my role. I stopped being the stunned husband trying to patch invisible wounds and became something else, an editor. She'd written her version of our story and handed it to the people around us in whispers and raised eyebrows. So I started redrafting. First, I changed the locks. Not all at once. Just the back door. Then the garage keypad. A locksmith came during the hours she said she'd be out running errands. I kept it casual. Routine home security updates. Nobody questions a man who sounds calm and pays in cash. Then came the digital boundaries. I separated our shared accounts. Not to trap her, but to prepare. Quiet moves. Necessary ones. I knew how these stories played out when one person stayed reactive too long. I wouldn't be that person. She'd expected resistance. A scene. Maybe even a meltdown that she could point to and say, "See? He's unstable. That's why I left." Instead, she came home to a man making tea and reading a book. And when she asked if I'd seen her spare charger, I simply looked up and said, "I moved a few things around." That was it. No edge. No explanation. Let her wonder. I didn't need to expose her yet. Exposure without strategy is just noise. I wasn't after victory. I was after control. Of the story. Of my dignity. Of the outcome. I started scanning old emails, looking for patterns, travel receipts, work event photos she hadn't shared. I wasn't looking for confrontation material. I was building context. I wanted to understand the scale before deciding what to do. I backed up documents, called an attorney, not to file anything, just to understand my options. We spoke for 30 minutes. I never said the word divorce. I didn't need to. The questions I asked made it clear where my mind was headed. And the strangest part? I felt calmer than I had in weeks. Not happy, not free, but grounded. I wasn't waiting for her next move anymore. I was making my own, one quiet step at a time. It came from someone I barely remembered, Jenna, I think her name was. She worked in another department, part of the same company web as Mark and by extension my wife. We'd met twice. Office holiday parties. Forgettable chatter. She messaged me directly. No preamble. No emojis. She said things might look worse than they are. Just thought you should know. That was it. No follow-up. No attempt to soften the impact. I stared at the screen, phone buzzing faintly in my hand, the late evening light casting a crooked shadow across the hardwood floor. It wasn't the message itself, it was the way she phrased it. Not an accusation, a disclaimer. Something my wife had planted like a preemptive shield. She'd been rehearsing her defense even before the fallout was fully visible. That meant she wasn't just trying to provoke me into appreciation. She was setting the stage in case the game collapsed. A fallback story. I responded with 2 words. They already do. No anger. No explanation. Just enough to let Jenna know her message had landed, and that I wasn't in the dark anymore. After I hit send, I sat with it. Let it settle. I'd been right to prepare. She wasn't improvising. She was drafting narratives on 2 tracks, one for me, to keep me unstable but compliant, and one for the people around her, to preserve her image when the truth surfaced. And now, one of her own had quietly stepped out of line. It told me more than any hacked phone or snooped text ever could. Because if someone from her circle was sending warnings, it meant the cracks were spreading. Someone saw through it. Someone felt uneasy. That unease, that's where power shifts. I didn't reply again. Didn't press for details. That's where most men make their mistake, chasing proof when they already have patterns. I had all the confirmation I needed. She thought distance would teach me to beg. That absence would distort my perspective. Instead, it cleared it. She didn't know I'd spoken to an attorney. That the locks had changed. That the financial ties were unraveling one thread at a time. She still believed she controlled the story. But the moment her friend texted me, that illusion collapsed. Now I wasn't reacting. I was preparing the final chapter. She came back on a Thursday, mid-afternoon, without warning. The same casual swagger in her step, like nothing had shifted. Like she expected to slot herself back into place before dinner. I was home. That was intentional. She walked in carrying her tote, keys jangling like punctuation, and gave a breezy, "Hey," as if she hadn't been gone, emotionally or physically, for most of the week. I didn't answer. Just stood from the table and watched her eyes move past me toward the hallway. It didn't take long. She paused, blinked once. The guest closet door was open. The space where her overflow clothes used to be, coats, spare shoes, her duffel bag from college, was empty. Clean. Organized. She frowned. "You cleaned up?" Her tone was forced light, but I heard the hitch underneath. Confusion wrapped in performance. I nodded, stepping aside so she could see the neat row of empty hangers. "You don't live here anymore." She didn't speak right away. Just stared like the sentence hadn't landed yet. Like she was waiting for a punchline. But I wasn't joking. I didn't yell. Didn't demand. I wasn't giving her something to argue with. I was making a statement, one she couldn't twist. "You're serious?" she asked finally, setting her bag down slower now, as if she was trying to ground herself. "Very." She looked around the house then, really looked, as if seeing it for the first time as something foreign. The framed photos she hadn't updated in a year. The keys on the counter she no longer recognized. The air had changed. It wasn't hers anymore. "You're overreacting," she said, but her voice faltered at the end. Not because she believed it, but because she realized I didn't. I watched her closely. Not to intimidate, to confirm. Her face cracked. Not the mask of indifference that had peeled days ago. This was different. She wasn't calculating anymore. She was realizing. This wasn't a bluff she could wait out. "I thought we were just giving each other space." "No," I said, calm as ever. "You thought you could control the tempo. Take what you needed and come back when it suited you. That's not how this works anymore." And in that moment I saw it. The exact second she understood that the power had shifted. Not because I yelled. Not because I forced it. But because I stopped playing. She hadn't expected resolve. She expected hesitation. And what she found instead was the quiet certainty of a man who no longer needed her permission to move on. Panic doesn't always arrive with screaming or broken things. Sometimes it slips in quietly, through the trembling of a voice, the rapid-fire texts that go unanswered, the sudden silence when charm stops working. That's how it started with her. By the next morning, she was calling. Once, twice, then again. Her tone had changed. Less dismissive. Now layered with something else. Urgency. I didn't answer. Not to provoke her. To protect my space. To stay clear-headed. Later that day, Mark called. I let it go to voicemail. His voice cracked a little, unprepared for the fallout. "Hey man, just want to make sure nothing got twisted. She said you might have misunderstood some things." Misunderstood. That was the line they had settled on. But his message told me what I needed. He didn't want to be in it anymore. He'd stepped in thinking he was a side character in a marital drama, maybe even a temporary hero in her self-authored redemption arc. Now, with the spotlight swinging his way, he realized he wasn't equipped to play the villain. I forwarded the voicemail to my attorney. Not for revenge, just documentation. By the weekend, the calls slowed. Her messages changed tone. Gone was the confident. "We need to talk," and in came, "Can we meet?" Just to clear the air. Then, "I think we've both made mistakes." She was looking for soft ground. But the irony? She'd taught me how to stay distant. She'd wanted space. She'd lectured me about clarity, perspective, independence. She'd left to prove a point. And now she was learning that absence doesn't always create longing. Sometimes it creates resolve. The people she expected to rally, the ones she'd fed the carefully tailored version of our story, started backing away. Not loudly. Just enough to feel cold when she reached out. I heard through mutual friends that she was taking some time off work. No one said why. But I knew. The attention she once courted had turned cautious. No one wants to get splashed when the tide turns. And in that emptiness, the one she'd built thinking I'd crumble, she stood alone. The stability she mocked? Gone. The affection she tested? Burned. She'd bet on distance making her more powerful. But distance taught me something else entirely. It taught me that peace is quieter when you're not clinging to someone who thought hurting you would teach you loyalty. She showed up unannounced the next week. Midday. No warning text. Just her car pulling into the driveway like it still belonged there. Like time and silence hadn't rearranged the entire landscape of what we were. I opened the door before she rang. She stood with her hands wrapped around her phone like it was a lifeline. Her voice trembled just enough to be noticeable. "You're just proving me right." I didn't answer at first. I waited. Watched her fill the silence with what she thought were winning words. "You're cold. This whole thing, how you've acted, it just shows how distant you really were." I leaned against the frame. Calm. Collected. The same man she'd hoped would beg now standing like a locked vault. "You wanted space," I said, slow, deliberate. "You taught me well." She blinked. Her mouth opened, then shut. Not because she didn't have a comeback, but because the tone had shifted so far from where she left it. That's the thing about trying to engineer consequences for someone else. You rarely plan for what happens when they start listening. When they take your terms literally. When they grow in the silence you thought would weaken them. She looked past me into the house. "Can we talk inside?" I stepped out and closed the door behind me. "No. Not out of cruelty. Out of clarity." She tried to gather her composure. "You're not even willing to try?" "You weren't testing our relationship," I said, meeting her eyes. "You were testing me. And when you test loyalty by acting disloyal, you don't get to act surprised when it disappears." The mask cracked again, deeper this time. She reached, verbally, emotionally. "I didn't do anything unforgivable." That was her line, her fallback. But forgiveness wasn't the issue. Trust was. And trust doesn't dissolve in fire. It unravels in silence, in the small, calculated choices someone makes when they think they're smarter than consequences. She stared at me like she didn't recognize the man standing there. That was intentional. The lesson had stuck, but not the way she meant. She tried to teach me that she could disappear and be welcomed back. Instead, I learned how to breathe without her.